Good afternoon. The caucuses are finally over. You know, I was thinking about it, the caucuses are kind of like Christmas. You start hearing about them months before you should, and the ads come on months before they should. At least with Christmas, there's some joy involved. I was asked to speak today about a topic relating to the media or politics or the caucuses, but I was told it should be done in a nonpartisan way. That shouldn't be too hard, I figured. If I'm going to talk about the news media, that's something everyone can agree on. After all, everyone hates them. Even my father-in-law. Well, he didn't hate them. After all, he was a reporter and editor at the Des Moines Register for 40 years in its glory days. But he didn't really want a reporter for a son-in-law. When my wife and I announced our plans to get engaged, he said, "I don't know which one of you is stupider. My daughter for marrying a reporter, or you for marrying a reporter's daughter." But still, I couldn't imagine a career that was different than being a reporter. I pitied the people who couldn't be a reporter. I couldn't understand someone not wanting to be in the know, not wanting to approach and question anyone, from the President of the United States to the Governor of Iowa to the Mayor of Davenport and to the mayors of 2nd Street. I loved the thrill of waking up, not knowing what the day would bring, not knowing that I might be smack dab in the middle of the news that day. The idea for my topic today came to me when I saw a candidate on TV speaking to a large crowd in Michigan, telling them that, unlike Vladimir Putin, he wouldn't kill reporters. He hates them, he said. They're terrible people. But no, he wouldn't kill them. The audience cheered. We often hear about how terrible the media is, as the gripers lump everyone from the Kardashians, the paparazzi, the World Weekly News, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times into the same swampy swill. I suppose I should understand. Heck, even the Senate chaplain once prayed for their souls on the floor of the Senate. "Eternal God," he said, "help these self-appointed vacuum cleaner journalists to discover how unproductive their efforts are." I'm sure Richard Nixon had an amen to that. Yes, there are reporters who cheat, lie, and distort. They bring dishonor on themselves and their profession. But the press can't be cast in black and white. There are many, many shades of gray, many more than 50. Sometimes the seemingly dopey or rude question has to be asked. Back in 1988, Paul Taylor of the Washington Post had to ask presidential candidate Gary Hart, "Have you ever committed adultery?" The public, along with big-name reporters with big reputations, harumphed at Taylor's impudence. Anthony Lewis wrote in the New York Times that it was a low point. William Safire said it was demeaning to our profession. I was trying to sort this all out when my father-in-law, who was covering that campaign, told me that all the reporters covering Hart knew that he had a woman problem, like a gunfighter notching his gun, if you follow my metaphor. After learning that, I was mad at the reporters for not asking that rude question sooner. I am of the school that wants to know everything. I believe what I don't know can hurt me. James Madison said that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own government must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives. The alternative to reporters is the official version of the truth from the government, and you don't want that. Judging all journalism based on the journalists covering a campaign, though, is like judging all musicians on a Miley Cyrus video. All the faults of the profession are magnified. Campaigning politicians are not standing up on a mountaintop of ethics and ideals. They are often down in the mud, slinging big promises and little lies, or the other way around. And the reporters follow them right down there. Unlike the chicken or egg debate, we know where this starts. There were people of power in this world long before there were reporters. There is plenty of terrific reporting that focuses on the candidates' plans and backgrounds, with perceptive analysis by very knowledgeable people. We just have to make the effort to look for that information. Because of the great freedom of our media in this country, we have to take the bad with the good. Today, I'd like to mount a bit of a defense of the people who bring you the information and ask you that you think about how you might function in this country without them. First, I'm going to touch on a few major points of the press in American history, then talk about how dangerous the job can be, what it takes to do the job, and finally, I'll give a brief look at the news media landscape today. To begin, this battle between our leaders and the press goes back to at least the very first multi-page newspaper in this country. In 1690, Boston printer Benjamin Harris published a paper called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. It featured news about a new date set for Thanksgiving, a smallpox epidemic raging in Boston, a despondent husband who killed himself because his wife had died, and a report about France and how the king had been rumored to be sleeping with his daughter-in-law. The British government shut the paper down after just one issue. The prevailing sentiment about the press at the time was summed up by the Virginia governor William Berkeley, who wrote, "I thank God there are no free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have these 100 years, for learning has brought disobedience, heresy, and printing has divulged them, and libels against the best government. God keep us from both." As the British government used to warn the governors coming into Massachusetts, great inconvenience may arise by the liberty of printing. The first paper published on a regular basis in the colonies didn't appear until 1704. And in the colonial years, and actually for the next 150 years, the press was deemed partisan, kind of like cable news today. The papers came with a point of view that permeated the entire papers, not just the editorial and opinion pages. In 1735, the law of the land was any criticism of the government or its agents was illegal, true or not. So when publisher John Peter Zenger pointed out the failings of the royal governor of New York, William Cosby, he was thrown in jail for several months that year. Zenger wrote that Cosby was corrupt and he was stealing land. Zenger's lawyer argued that it was all true, and despite the law, he tried to make that case, and the jury acquitted Zenger. This established the idea that the newspaper had the inherent right to publish the truth without fear of punishment, and was part of the reasoning behind the First Amendment. And it influenced the founders to purposefully establish the role of the press to be the unofficial fourth branch of government, the fourth estate, to watch over the other three. Too often I hear people say the press are unelected, and I want to scream, yes! That was done on purpose. They are the people's representatives. It is the most democratic branch of all. Anyone can be a member of the press. You don't need a super PAC to be a reporter. You just need a job. And these days, you just need a computer. Thomas Jefferson was confident that even if the printers or media of the day may be led astray for a moment, they will soon correct themselves. To punish those errors too severely would be to suppress the only safeguard of public liberty. Take note, Jefferson wouldn't have killed reporters. And even though Jefferson was annoyed by reporters, especially while president, he thought everyone should have access to a paper because the basis of our government, he said, being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate to choose the latter. The founders realized how important the free press was to educate the electorate and believed so strongly that the government had to make sure the free press survived that they subsidized it. Yes, they subsidized it and still do. In several ways, going back even before the Postal Act of 1792, newspapers got preferred rates, and to this day, many have contracts to print government notices, some making 10 to 15% of their yearly income on those notices. Throughout our history, there have been many determined printers and reporters who have faced far more serious intimidation than political rhetoric from a guy in a pinstripe suit with an intriguing hairdo. Perhaps no one faced more intimidation than Elijah Lovejoy. Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister in St. Louis in the 1830s. He began publishing a religious and abolitionist paper, the St. Louis Observer. Some people didn't like what he had to say, so they destroyed his printing press. Lovejoy got a new one, and a mob came and destroyed that one too. He ordered a third press and arranged to have it delivered late at night, but a mob got wind of the delivery date and destroyed it upon arrival. Lovejoy got the message, sort of. He moved across the river to Afton, Illinois, the free state of Illinois, and ordered a fourth press and began publishing the Alton Observer. Again, a mob came. This time, the mob brought guns, and Elijah Lovejoy was killed for delivering a message some didn't agree with. He was 37 years old. Around this time, in the 1830s, the press became more available to the people. Benjamin Day of the New York Sun realized he could reduce the price of his paper to a penny if he sold advertising. Since the paper was so cheap, more people could afford it. Thus began what we call the era of the penny press. Seems pretty commonsensical today, but in the 1830s, it was a revelation and a revolution because it allowed many more people access to news of the day, and that meant more people could participate in our democracy. Beginning with the Mexican War in the 1840s and picking up steam in the Civil War, reporters were using the telegraph to transmit their stories from far-flung battlefields. A high word count sent over the new technology was expensive, so they had to cut down on their colorful and opinionated writing. And publishers realized that sharing stories cut down on expenses. Because not all papers could afford to send reporters from the Northeast to the battlefields down south, so the stories had to be written objectively so all papers could use them. The objective reporting idea stuck, although it wasn't always adhered to by some reporters and their bosses. The 1890s was the period of yellow journalism, where the press often made as much news as it covered. One story is that before the start of the Spanish-American War, artist Frederick Remington was sent to Cuba by William Randolph Hearst to supply pictures for Hearst's New York Journal. Remington got to Cuba, found no action, and said he was coming home. Hearst is said to have cabled back, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." I actually felt nauseated while listening to a presidential candidate joke about eliminating members of the Fourth Estate. People who, if you think about it intellectually for 5 seconds, are essential to our democracy. They give us what famed political columnist Walter Lippmann said was a picture of reality upon which men can act. He was writing in the 1920s. My father-in-law was a journalist, as was my wife, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, several groomsmen at my wedding, Ben Franklin, Stephen Crane, Ernest Hemingway, George Orwell, and I could go on. So I was not too happy to hear someone joking about putting reporters to death, especially when it came just 1 year after ISIS beheaded James Foley. His crime? He was an American, and he was a reporter. According to the International Federation of Journalists, 115 journalists are killed worldwide almost every year. 115 last year, 135 in 2014, 123 in 2013, and already 13 have been killed this year. A journalist in Mexico was stabbed just 3 days ago in his home for what he wrote. These people were killed doing their job. Many of the murders happen in war zones such as Afghanistan and Syria, and countries struggling with corruption such as Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. But those murders and deaths should not be discounted. Those reporters who died weren't part of the news media element that reports or corresponds from their air-conditioned studios in New York or Florida or LA. They were reporters who were trying to make their countries better by shining the light of truth on corruption and war and politics. They were in some dusty, desolate part of the world, fighting the fight for truth that was fought in this country many years ago and continues today. I do get exhausted with politicians who spend their time running against the press rather than standing up for something. They dodge questions about their records to attack the media time and again. More of our politicians should study the newly minted Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. He seems to understand the role of reporters. Shortly after his election last fall, Trudeau was asked a tough question by a reporter. Some reporters were surrounding him and groaned loudly, trying to drown out the reporter. Trudeau put his arms up and turned to his supporters and said, "Hey, we have respect for journalists in this country," he said, turning toward them. "They ask tough questions, and they have to. That's their job." We should never demean the majority of serious news people to satisfy our bloodlust for the few bad reporters. Reporters should not be the cheap political applause line of first resort. When done right, journalism is a noble profession, or as Herbert Bayard Swope said, who was the very first winner of the Pulitzer Prize and a 3-time winner overall, he called it a priestly mission with high dignity. This is basically what is taught to aspiring journalists: seek the information people need, tell the truth, and be accurate. That's what Robert Capa strived to do. You might know Capa's work if you remember the picture taken on the beach at Normandy on D-Day. I'm sure many of you know it. It's pretty grainy, but it focuses on a grim, wide-eyed Marine taking cover in the only available cover on that beach, the shallow water. The picture holds us as we stare into that Marine's eyes and feel a bit of the terror he felt that day. But now, consider what Robert Capa did that day. He charged onto the beach too, armed with a camera. And then he turned his back to the fire, turned around and faced the soldiers coming onto the beach so he could give us the news. That simple, amazing photograph still tells us so much about that frightful day. Robert Capa survived that invasion and the war, but he died covering Vietnam when he stepped on a landmine. He was 40 years old. Being the messenger has never been easy. It certainly wasn't easy when Thucydides covered the Peloponnesian Wars in 500 BC. He wrote he got eyewitness accounts that he checked out thoroughly. And even then, he said, the truth was not easy to discover. Different eyewitnesses gave different accounts of the same events, speaking out of partiality from one side or the other, or else from imperfect memories. Thucydides was backed up by Bill Kovach, the former editor of the New York Times and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Kovach wrote a book, The Elements of Journalism, about the difficulty of the reporter's trade. He said, "You have to sift through the rumors, the gossip, the failed memories, the manipulative agendas, and try to capture something as accurately as possible. No easy task. Hard to satisfy your sources, your editors, your owners, and the public. You never make everyone happy. Every day, reporters face an impossible, but not wholly unreasonable, expectations because they are facing a mass audience who come to their work with varied expectations. Those in the audience believe they know how the media should do their jobs because they have been consuming it all their lives. They can buy a paper, read a magazine, turn on a TV, so they know. But how do they know? How do they differentiate between the media they are consuming? Media literacy is not part of the general education requirements for most public schools or universities. There is the press that was following Princess Di into that tunnel. that follow Jackie O around and around. They are the press, to be sure, but more accurately, the tabloid press. A reporter for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or the Daily Dispatch, or the North Scott Press is not the same as a reporter for TMZ. And news on cable requires a graduate seminar to decipher, because it can be airing a legitimate news program and then suddenly bleed into some inflammatory commentary in an effort to keep people from changing the channel. Cable news junkies should know what they're getting or not getting. Cable channels have a handful of reporters compared to the Wall Street Journal, which has a staff of 1,800 people worldwide. The New York Times has a staff of roughly 1,300 people in its newsroom. Both papers have reporters all over the world and not just in the cushy European capitals. I do an exercise with my students to give them a hint of what readers and viewers will expect on every story. I go around the classroom and ask them to name one quality a reporter needs to have to succeed. And then I go around the room again, and then again. And in just a few minutes, we can come up with about 60 qualities. Imagination, accuracy, speed, perseverance, organization, nerve, intelligence, skepticism, not cynicism, curiosity, honesty, endurance, ingenuity, and on. And then I ask, how many have all of them? And they giggle, because they don't have many, and even half. Not many of us have all those qualities, but to be a good reporter, you need those qualities almost every day on almost every story. But even the best reporters will slip up and make mistakes, because we all do. And because their stories are seen by thousands of eyes, those collective eyes will not miss that mistake, be it in spelling, grammar, facts, or tone. And even when a reporter does his or her job, the audience doesn't always recognize it. We don't notice the wheel that isn't squeaking. These days, the media landscape is pretty grim. Yes, it's still exciting to be in it, but it is increasingly a young person's field. Not because they have more energy to cover the news at all hours, but because they are used to being poor and eating ramen noodles. The median wage for a reporter is now $45,000. That's less than the national average for all U.S. workers. $45,000 for a 50-year-old reporter with 2 kids, 2 car payments, and a mortgage? It's not going to attract the best and the brightest to the business. A former student emailed me last week about the owners of her old paper. The news staff there hadn't had a raise in 8 years. And they formed a union, went into negotiations, and the settlement was $13 an hour for full-time workers, $11 for part-time. So that adds up to about $27,000 for a full-time reporter in the capital city of Springfield, Illinois. My former student, well, after 6 or 7 years in the news business, she's now a nurse. She couldn't afford to stay a reporter. Local TV news has reduced staff drastically in the last 20 years while increasing the number of shows that the staff must produce. They've gone from the 6 and 10 to the early morning, the mid-morning, the noon, the 5, the 6, the 6:30, and the 10, from 2 shows to 7. Radio news, except on public radio stations and in some big markets, has gone the way of the rotary phone. Our local news talk radio station had 5 news people just 10 years ago. They're all gone. The news may sound local, but it's being read in remote locations and tagged here. In newspapers, the saddest story of them all. In the last 15 years, we now have lost more than 20,000 newsroom jobs in this country, a drop of over 42%. How would you feel if we had 42% fewer cops on the street, or 42% fewer teachers in your kids' school? Despite this downturn, we are lucky. We still have people who love being reporters, love asking tough questions, love being the people's representatives. For example, a county sheriff in central Iowa was pushing hard on his board of supervisors for a new jail because it was always overflowing. So a reporter friend of mine who works at the Register asked the sheriff for the number of inmates for the last 12 months. The figures did show that the jail was operating beyond capacity. But my friend, who has been a reporter for a long time, he doesn't have any kids. His bills are lower. He had one more request. He asked the sheriff for the number of meals served at the jail for the last 12 months. And then he compared the number of meals with the number of prisoners, and they didn't add up. There were far fewer meals served than the prisoners should have had. It turns out the sheriff wasn't starving the prisoners. He had just inflated the number of prisoners he had in custody. The sheriff either wasn't clever enough to inflate the number of meals served, or he had no idea he would run into a clever and persistent reporter. The sheriff didn't get his new jail. My friend, the watchdog, saved the citizens a bunch of money. I'm sure the sheriff thinks the reporter asked him gotcha questions. But that's what the founders intended when they made the press the fourth estate. And that's what we, the people, need more of today. Tough questions and officials who can answer those tough questions and not attack the messenger. To wrap this up, remember, reporters represent the Constitution. They represent the history of this country. They represent our right to ask and our right to know. Being an informed citizen should be a sacred act for every American, just as sacred as serving on a jury or voting in every election. Every time someone disparages reporters and their efforts, I think of Robert Capa charging onto the beach at Normandy. I think of Edward R. Murrow reporting from the rooftops of London. I think of James Foley and Daniel Pearl, who died covering our wars in the Middle East. I think of Elijah Lovejoy, who died defending his and our right to free speech. And I think of the 100+ reporters who will die this year and who die every year around the world trying to tell us what is going on, giving us information upon which we can act. So no, don't kill the messenger.